One of the most incisive aphorisms I ever heard goes like this: nostalgia is not what it used to be. I fully concur. Today we're going to discuss the role nostalgia plays in our lives and in the relationship between victims and their abusers. My name is Sam Vaknin. I am the nostalgic author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a professor of psychology. So I started by saying that nostalgia binds victims to their abusers and abusers to their victims. To understand how, please go to the description and click on the link. It's a video titled How Narcissist Remembers You. Dark, then rosy retrospection, nostalgic recall. So I'll not go into it in this video. Today I want to discuss nostalgia in general. Nostalgia is when we are fixated on the past somehow. The fixation could last a few minutes, a few seconds, a few days, few weeks, or longer when it becomes rumination. This obsession with the past, this wistful longing, this sentimental yearning for the past, is the core of nostalgia. Indeed, the word nostalgia includes a portion which means pain. It's a painful feeling. It's a form of attenuated mourning or grief. Nostalgic people are emotionally intense and they are other directed. Nostalgia is mostly about bygone relationships with other people. When we imagine a nostalgic scene, when we travel back in time to the past, it's usually populated with other people. Their discourse, interactions with them, emotions they evoked in us, and the general character of the relationship, the affective hues of the relationship. Nostalgia was coined, it's a word that was coined in 1680 by, what else? A Swiss medical student. Nostalgia was once considered a physical disease, a form of pathological homesickness that affected the body adversely and caused illness and even death. To this very day, we can still find in museums and archives death certificates listing nostalgia as the cause of death. Actually, nostalgia was the leading cause of death on death certificates during the 18th and 19th century among certain types of people, certain groups of people. People in extreme duress or distress, for example, the young, soldiers, slaves, domestic servants, and so on. Well into the 20th century, nostalgia was still considered a disease, albeit not physical, mental, a mental health condition. Nowadays, contemporary nostalgia is, as I started by saying, not what it used to be. Nostalgia is 30 times more prevalent among older people and among the affluent. But it can also be spotted in children. Even children go through nostalgic periods and nostalgic effects. Some personality traits, maybe even some genes, predispose people to nostalgia. Strangely, even people with extreme advanced dementia, Alzheimer's disease, for example, experience nostalgia. Actually, there's something called nostalgia therapy. People with dementia are subjected to nostalgia therapy where meaningful personal memories and feelings are triggered by the therapy so as to restore a sense of self, a sense of personal continuity. We should not confuse nostalgia therapy with reminiscence therapy, which is something completely different. So what is nostalgia? I think nostalgia is a way to remind yourself who you are, to cement your core identity, to dial back Any confusions with regards to your essence, your quiddity, to kind of mitigate or ameliorate moments of identity diffusion, to maintain a sense of continuity. And I think, therefore, that nostalgia is a maintenance chore of the self. As the self tries to make sense of past experiences, nostalgia becomes an organizing principle and a hermeneutic principle, with explanatory power. Nostalgia kind of rearranges the mental furniture when it comes to the past and imbues everything with a fuzzy, warm glow of experience. Nostalgia, therefore, involves selective memory. Nostalgia is not about factual historiography or actual autobiography or episodic uncontested memory. No, that's not nostalgia. Nostalgia is definitely selective. It engages mechanisms such as reframing. It is intimately linked with other psychological defense mechanisms. And it rewrites the narrative, creates a piece of fiction. Nostalgia creates a piece of fiction, a storyline, a movie about one's past. Nostalgia is triggered mainly by sensory inputs such as smell or sights, but it can also be triggered by internal psychological processes and constructs such as memories. Sights, sounds, smells trigger internal dynamics, psychological dynamics, which in turn latch onto memories and trigger what you might call the identity function. I think that in the absence of nostalgia, maintaining a sense of identity would be extremely difficult. Indeed, we will discuss nostalgia in people with borderline and narcissistic personality disorders a bit later. So nostalgia is actually a trait, a dispositional variable. And we distinguish between trait nostalgia and state nostalgia. State nostalgia is when nostalgia is triggered by specific circumstances or environments or stimuli or inputs or cues from the surroundings. Nostalgia is a perception. I wouldn't say a misperception, more like a perception of losses. The losses are perceived as irretrievable, irreversible. No way to compensate for these losses. No way to, as the Germans would put it, Wiedergutmachung. No way to make it good again. These losses are mostly imaginary. When we analyze the actual factual historical content or autobiographical content of the nostalgia, we discover that there's a lot of falsifying going around, a lot of rewriting history, a lot of totally fictitious narrative. So many of the losses, a lot of the mourning and the grief that takes place within nostalgia are totally imaginary. Nostalgia is about dissolved relational fantasies. There is a fantasy of a relationship. The relationship could be with another person, a group of people, an environment, a job, a belief system, a value system, personal standing and status, whatever. There's a relationship there. And these relationships are fantastic. In the mind of the beholder, there's a fantasy of the relationship, a relational fantasy. And as this fantasy dissolves under the pressure of reality or pressures of reality, as this fantasy cracks, falls apart, is fragmented, nostalgia is the reaction to this inevitable, inexorable process. Nostalgia is about the imaginaries of freedom and well-being. Again, the explicit and implicit content of nostalgia is we used to have it better. We used to feel better. Our well-being was much higher. We were much more free than we are today. It's about freedom. It's about emotional well-being, not about bygone factual reality. And emotional well-being is intimately linked with relationships which are nurturing, relationships which are containing and holding and accepting and compassionate and empathic and loving and caring. So relationships and a sense of well-being go together within the nostalgic, fantastic, imaginary space. Similarly, the sense of freedom is intimately linked with what we call in child psychology secure base, the feeling of stability, of safety, of certainty, of determinacy, the knowledge that nothing bad is going to happen to you, or the anticipation that nothing bad is going to happen to you. This goes hand in hand with parental figures. It is not therefore surprising that nostalgia, in a majority of cases, focuses on childhood, either early childhood, late childhood, or even to some extent early adolescence. When we are nostalgic, we are mostly nostalgic about the time that we were younger, much younger. As younger people, we've had much more freedom. We didn't have a mortgage, we didn't have to pay taxes, we didn't have children, we were not attached or committed or married. There was a lot more freedom. Nostalgia is therefore the mourning or grief of lost freedoms. What about people who have difficulties with memory, identity, reality? What about such people? For example, people with narcissistic or borderline personality disorders, or other people with dissociation. Can they be nostalgic? If you can't remember the past accurately, if most of your personal autobiography and episodic memory are mere confabulations, if you're afraid of your own emotions, if your identity is in flux, you have identity diffusion, identity disturbance, can you actually experience nostalgia? The answer is yes, even more so than healthy people. Because in narcissism and borderline, the number one compensatory mechanism is fantasy. Both narcissism and borderline, pathological narcissism, and borderline personality organization can be described as virtual reality, as the substitution of fantasy for a rejected and decried reality. The stronger, the more all-pervasive and ubiquitous the fantasy, the more there's place for nostalgia. Because remember, nostalgia is not about facts, it's not about history, it's not even about the past. It's about the imaginary fantasy of the past and the losses associated with the inevitable dissolution of that fantasy. And this is the core dynamic in narcissism and borderline. The difference between narcissism and borderline is whereas borderlines embrace nostalgia, they wallow in nostalgia, they immerse themselves in nostalgia. Nostalgia, this sense of all-pervading sadness, this melancholy, lethargy, if you wish, this perception of diffusion into a distant, free past. These are nurtured by borderlines. These are cultivated by borderlines. They cherish and adore this sensation. They bring it on intentionally. It's not the case with narcissists. Narcissists defend against nostalgia by repressing it and numbing themselves. So when the narcissist is in threat of experiencing nostalgia, the narcissist is likely to go emotionally numb and reduce affect display. In many ways, when the narcissist comes across nostalgia with its attendant grief and mourning and emotions, the narcissist becomes some kind of primary psychopath. Borderlines and narcissists also have bouts of anticipatory nostalgia, mourning or grieving for anticipated but ineluctable loss. That means you anticipate some loss and then you mourn and grieve in advance for this loss, even though it hasn't happened. It's a kind of future orientation rather than past orientation. Anticipatory nostalgia is very common among narcissists and borderlines. Now, nostalgia could become rumination, as I've said earlier. If it is carried for too long, it's a form of prolonged grief disorder. It could lead to wallowing, resentment, and grievances. And that's why we have nostalgia politics. It is a past orientation rather than a mindful presence. Nostalgia is bittersweet. Nostalgia is dissonant. It's ambivalent because nostalgia has concomitant positive effects, warmth, fuzziness, a sense of safety, a sense of freedom. These are all positive, but they go hand in hand with negative emotions. For example, sadness. Nostalgia tugs at your heartstrings both ways. And this is perhaps the only affective state where we have two simultaneous, mutually exclusive sets of emotions or feelings, some of them highly positive and correlated with an elevated level of well-being and happiness, and some of them highly negative and usually associated with depression. Nostalgia is therefore anxiogenic on the one hand, because you say to yourself, things have been better. As a child, I used to be much freer. So you're mourning, you're grieving. This creates anxiety. And at the same time, it's anxiolytic. It reduces anxiety. It's like saying, I'm so lucky and I'm so happy that I have these memories. I'm so blessed to have had these experiences. And there is hope because I've had them once, I may have them again. So at the same time, nostalgia elevates anxiety and then immediately reduces it. It is arousing, it creates arousal. Nostalgia is actionable, it steers people to action, it moves them on to act. Nostalgia could even contribute to emotional dysregulation in susceptible people, such as the aforementioned borderlines. Nostalgia is not only an individual artifact or individual phenomenon, because it encourages social and romantic bonding and cohesion. Nostalgia mobilizes in many ways, and in other ways cements or augments already existing effects. So if you're romantically attracted to someone or romantically attached to someone, nostalgia will help you to enhance this emotion. Similarly, if you hate someone, it will have the same impact. It is a social emotion. Nostalgia can be vicarious and historical rather than personal. You could be nostalgic for a certain period in history. When nostalgia is shared in groups, it is therefore experienced positively. It makes us feel better because it enhances affiliation. It could be a form of shared fantasy. I think nostalgia is a form of shared fantasy. And today we see a rise in nostalgia politics all around the world because as other forms of belonging, for example, social institutions such as marriage, family, even committed relationships, as these forms of belonging crumble, as we are more and more lonely and atomized, we seek to belong. We want to be accepted among like-minded people, people who share our values and outlook on life. And nostalgia is the glue that holds us or holds all of us together within a highly specific in-group. Of course, at the same time, shared nostalgia excludes people who are incapable of sharing the same memories, incapable of sharing the same experiences, incapable, in other words, of going through the nostalgic process. Nostalgia is therefore both inclusionary and exclusionary, and in this sense, it's perfectly suited for populist politics. In populist politics, there's always an in-group and an out-group. Nostalgia is the great-great-great-grandmother of authoritarianism.